Greetings, sisters and brothers. Welcome to African History Club. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. I welcome all existing members. I welcome the new members that have just joined us as we take this survey of different aspects of African history, as we look at the different regions of Africa to sort of fill in this puzzle. And once we have this puzzle all filled in, we will then have a strong foundational understanding of Africa's history, which then allows us to have a better understanding of contemporary conditions in Africa today, in the 21st century, and how it is that Africa is still exploited by the outside world, using Africa's resources to enrich others rather than to enrich Africa and improve the lives of Africans. So today we're going to be focused on the region that is known as the Maghreb, which is primarily North Africa west of Egypt. And as I indicated earlier, we will only mention Egypt tangentially in today's podcast because Egypt is also going to be a focus in a subsequent podcast that will be looking at the ancient societies. I always avoid that word civilization, as my hero Walter Rodney always warned. When you start talking about civilizations, it automatically suggests that other societies were not civilized. So I will look at the ancient Egyptian society, I will look at Nubia, and I will look at Aksum in a subsequent podcast. That is why Egypt will only be mentioned tangentially today. So when we talk about the Maghreb and we look at the modern nations of the 21st century, we are referring to Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Mauritania, and the Sahrawi Democratic Arab Republic, which has been occupied by Morocco since 1975, also sometimes in the past referred to as Spanish Sahara. It's hard to imagine that the Sahara and what is now the Sahara Desert was once a lush green area of Africa. It's really hard to contemplate that, but it's true. 8,000 years ago, at least 8,000 years ago, and even earlier than that. And how do we know that? By the historic rock paintings discovered in the 1950s in caves in what is today Algeria. And what do these paintings from 8,000 years ago show? They show Africans dressed in tunics resembling pretty much the kind of tunics worn later in Egypt, ancient Egypt. They show Africans using ox-drawn plows to till the soil, meaning they were already engaged in agriculture at that very early stage. They show Africans hunting for wild game, and they show a area that was indeed lush and green and inhabited by Africans. It was about 4,500 years ago that the Sahara started drying up. The rainfall disappeared, the bodies of water disappeared, the animals disappeared, and ultimately human beings also started migrating away from that area. And the migration occurred in a number of directions. Some went south toward the tropical rainforest, some went southwest, and some went east to the Nile Valley that had been settled because of the fertile soil along the banks of the Nile, and found people that were also engaged in agriculture. So now we start the very unique and interesting aspect of the history of North Africa. And it gives us a better understanding of why sometimes there's confusion as to whether North Africa is more oriented toward, quote unquote, the Arab world or the so-called Middle East and the Mediterranean. The history understands why it is like that when we look at this particular aspect of its past. So then the region was inhabited by Berbers, and at some times there were multiple invasions of that region. North Africa was the gateway to Africa relative to the Mediterranean world. So the first major occupation was by the Phoenicians, a maritime power at that time. And it shows you the importance of seafaring societies, maritime powers. And it's no coincidence that it was the maritime powers that became the leading nations in terms of foreign conquest, plunder, and domination of other societies, and extraction of wealth and surplus from other communities. So we see we're talking BC at this stage. One of the most important city-states set up by the Phoenicians was Carthage. There were a number of other city-states along the coast of North Africa, but Carthage, set up around the 9th century BC, was one of the most important ones and grew powerful and wealthy, engaging in trade with the Mediterranean world, engaging in trade with the interior of Africa, meaning Africa south of that part of North Africa. And some of the commodities, primary commodities that extracted from the southern part of Africa relative to North Africa was gold, ivory, and other products, and also from North Africa and exported to other parts of the Mediterranean world and Europe, olives, fruits, and animal hides. It was a very lucrative trade, so there was a lot of contestation for control of the North African coastal region. Ultimately, there were three major wars fought between Carthage and Rome, and that was the so-called Punic Wars, three primary wars. And the first one was in 264 BC. And that war lasted for 23 years. Ultimately, Carthage was defeated and lost Sicily and had to pay reparations to Rome. And some of the Berber kings actually joined in a number of these wars against Rome. A Berber king such as Massinissa, Massinissa, was one of the major leaders of the Berbers who sided with Carthage against Rome. The Second Punic War was in 218 BC, and on that occasion, the legendary general Hannibal crossed the Alps and invaded Italy. And that war lasted for 14 years. The occupation lasted for 14 years. But then Rome was able to invade Carthage, and Hannibal was recalled to try to defend Carthage. And he was ultimately defeated in 204 BC at the Battle of Zama. And ultimately, Rome attacked Carthage in 149 BC and completely destroyed the city and massacred most of the people in Carthage and set up the era of Roman domination in the Maghreb, but extending farther east and controlled Egypt as well. So when you look back and you watch, I know there are many films, including feature films, that always shows the wealth of Rome and the gold and other spectacular minerals and jewelry. Very few people wondered where they ever came from. Well, most of these riches were coming, of course, from Africa. So we see the history of imperialism, European imperialism in Africa, occurring at a very early stage, because all these wars were for the control of North Africa, and that was the gateway to the rest of the continent and to Africa's wealth. So when most people think about European imperialism and conquest and domination of Africa, we think of more recent era. We think of the 15th century, 16th century, the era of enslavement. We think of the 19th century, the era of formal colonization. But no, not at all. The history goes much deeper and much farther than that, as we can see. So a lot of the wealth was coming from Africa, and a lot of the innovation also actually came from Africa. So for example, going back to how I started with 8,000 years ago, the paintings that were found in the mountains in Algeria also showed chariots that were harnessed to horses, meaning they already had that technology and innovation at that time. Africans had that in North Africa at that time, and this was pre-occupied Africa. So this was an African innovation. And the Greeks obviously started using that innovation much later, meaning they learned in terms of harnessing horses to chariots. That came also from Africa. So Rome set up its empire in Africa, and that lasted for centuries until the Romans were defeated in Carthage by the Vandals. The Vandals are a Germanic tribe from Europe, defeated the Romans in Carthage. So I think now you get a sense of where the word Vandals also come from. And then, of course, the next and most distinct of all these invasions was the Arab Islamic invasion, when Islam was becoming the dominant power. The followers of the Prophet Muhammad invaded and ultimately defeated the Byzantine, the Roman Empire, and occupied Egypt and occupied Carthage and the rest of the Maghreb as well. So that was a very significant transformation, the end of Rome's empire in Africa. And the Arab Islamic invasion was also extending from the Nile Valley toward the southern part of Africa, and it was only checked and stopped due to the superior horsemanship of the Nubian people, as well as the skills of their archers. They were able to stop that advance. But by the 8th century, of course, North Africa was now under the dominant influence of the Islamic Arabs. And so that gives us an indication of the history and a better understanding of the unique relationship between North Africa, between Arab Islamic North Africa, and the rest of the African continent, in terms of why sometimes there is an appearance and actually a reality of the politics of that part of Africa being more oriented toward the so-called Arab world, toward the so-called Middle East and the Mediterranean world. But of course, there are North African leaders who were ideologically very Africa oriented in their outlook and in their objective politics. And of course, comes to mind the late Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, who was a huge, powerful Pan-African, a dedicated Pan-African, and was one of the primary movers of what was then the Organization of African Unity, which has since been replaced by the African Union. Nasser was involved not only rhetorically, but actively in the liberation struggle in Africa, when other African countries in the 1960s still fighting against colonialism. Many of the liberation movements had their offices in Cairo, and they got not only financial, but they also got military support from Nasser. And then, of course, in terms of another North African leader who was very Pan-African and African-oriented, was the late Muammar Gaddafi, who was, of course, murdered after the NATO war on Libya. And he was also very Pan-African and Africa-oriented, and his outlook, and actually ultimately paid the price for that as well. Because when NATO, the United States, Britain, France, could not get the African Union to support the NATO war on Libya, suddenly Libya was removed out of Africa geographically and politically and placed in the auspices of the Arab League. And many of the leaders in the Arab world, of course, detested Gaddafi because he verbally used to abuse them and call them stooges and puppets of the West. So, of course, it was not surprising that they voted in favor of the NATO invasion and destruction of Libya, and ultimately Libya has now descended back into the Stone Age era, barbarically destroyed by the NATO countries, by Europe, by the United States. I had the privilege actually to visit Libya before the NATO war. And I went in 2010, and I went and saw some of those magnificent Roman ruins in Libya, because obviously Libya did not exist as the nation of Libya at that time. So it was part of the area, which was part of the Roman Empire in North Africa, and they're quite spectacular sight to behold. So I think this brings us now to the end of episode number 7. I think it gives us a better understanding as to why sometimes the politics and the outlook of the leaders in North Africa seem to be distinctively different from that of the rest of Africa. And as I said earlier in a podcast, and I repeat again, sometimes the rest of Africa, south of the North African region, is referred to as Sub-Saharan Africa. That is a term that I don't use, and I strongly discourage people not to use that term. I do not think it's a good idea to have the word sub in any sentence relating to anything about Africa or Africans, for very obvious reasons that I don't need to explain to any conscious person. Now, before I sign off, I'd like to recommend a few books. As usual, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, Rodney. The second book is A General History of Africa, Volume 4, Africa from the 12th to the 16th century. And we've used that in our earlier podcast, and the editor is Key Zerbo, K-I, and then hyphen Z-E-R-B-O. And the other one is General History of Africa, Volume 3, Africa from the 7th to the 11th century. Editor's name is Herbeck, H-R-B-E-K. And then Africa in History by Basil Davidson, and Davidson is D-A-V-I-D-S-O-N. And next week we'll be looking at the ancient societies of Africa, specifically Egypt, Nubia, and Aksum. Once again, I welcome all the new members, and many of you know that this African History Club podcast was inspired by my late friend, Michael Brooks. May he rest in peace. And all of you, stay well, stay strong, stay Pan-African, and see you next week.